parts. So it's actually been kind of nice in my apartment the last few days. Well, at least today. And so I don't have to have my heat on. It won't be nearly as annoying. But we have our new candles, Dancing in the Rain, and coffee break. Excuse me. But they're in these little milk jugs, which I thought was so cute. And they smell so good. My mom is really after me to let her have one of the little milk bottles when we're done. So. Chapter 8, St. Joe's Ghost. St. Joseph, Missouri. St. Joseph, one of Missouri's oldest cities, is also one of its most haunted. Having approximately 72,000 residents, St. Joe cannot compete on a per capita basis with Windyville, which Ronnie Powell tells us now has less than a dozen inhabitants. Still, St. Joseph's ghosts are impressive for variety and persistence. This is only to be expected when a city has had more than its share of excitement and striving. St. Joseph's history goes back to 1790, when a fur company's representative, Joseph Robideau, established a trading post that became a major rendezvous for trappers and fur traders. In 1834, the city got its name, and in 1860, the Romantic Pony Express began there. Famous as jumping-off place for pioneers heading west, this city, built on bluffs overlooking the Missouri River, also bustled for decades with vital steamboat traffic. Great fortunes were earned in St. Joseph, resulting in the building of picturesque mansions, many of which still stand. To all who love old architecture, St. Joseph is one of the most interesting of Missouri cities. The city also abounds in museums, offering at least 10. So far, St. Joseph's ghostly history doesn't seem to have been stressed in its publicity, but possibly it should be. In 1989 and in 1993, the St. Joseph, Missouri News Press Gazette published full-page discussions of the town's ghosts, never repeating anything. In addition, the library has a full-page photocopy of a similar review published in the late 30s or early 40s, and none of the latter stories derive from this, so the city is rich indeed in ghosts. Here are some of the most outstanding. A multifaceted ghost. "Mama, where are you, Mama?" These words, in a shrill, childlike voice, awakened Lois Hughes on the first night spent in a historic house she and her husband had just bought. That was only a prelude to what appears to be activity of either a host of ghosts or one spirit with wide-ranging abilities. The Hudgeses, there's a lot of E's and S's, and their daughter Joanne soon became familiar with the standard manifestations. Cold spots, sounds from inside the walls, footsteps where nobody could be. In addition, they had a self-playing baby grand piano. And one time, they told the newspaper reporter orchestral music came from an empty room. Another unique event was the arrival of police, come to investigate screaming that neighbors reported hearing from the Hugheses upstairs. Lois and her sister, watching television downstairs, had heard nothing unusual. Strangest of all was a figure appearing in pictures taken on the second-floor landing by a magazine photographer doing a feature on the castle-like mansion. Everywhere his work came out as expected, but a series of shots showing aspects of the lovely spacious landing included a filmy figure, gender unclear, which seemed to move past in front of the camera. On the advice of a clairvoyant, Lois began keeping open Bibles and glasses of water in several rooms. This was supposed to reduce spirit activity, and seemed to do so as long as the objects stayed in place. The clairvoyant advised that when family members heard voices in remote parts of the house, they should call out, "Be gone with you, and God bless you." Though they did not deeply research the history of their house, Lois did learn that it was built in 1890 by James McAllister, a prominent banker. His family left soon, possibly because their 2-year-old son died there of diphtheria. They had a death mask cast, and a sculpted version of this was hung outdoors at the carriage entrance. Lois said each family to occupy the house suffered a death. In her own case, it was her mother. For one couple, it was a young son. During a period in the mid-40s, when the house served as a city museum, a local historian named Roy Coy, that's an interesting name, said many puzzling little events occurred. One he recalled most vividly came when he was alone there at night reading at his desk. From the corner of his eye, he saw the doorknob turn, and the door opened completely. Nobody was there, and Coy knew nobody else was in the locked-up building that night. Another time, he and an assistant were working together in the basement when both heard the front door slam and footsteps ascend to the main staircase. They knew that the front doors were secured and that nobody else was on duty. As many other dwellers in the house that appear to be haunted have done, Lois and Ben Hughes developed fondness for their bodiless housemates and told the reporter they would keep the place. Their daughter had asked them to, so she would have it someday. Lois concluded her interview with these words: "We don't call our house haunted. We say it has spirit." A weightlifting ghost. For about 40 years, the staff of St. Joseph's Central Library has been entertained and inconvenienced by a feisty ghost they call Rosie. Nobody knows who she was, but she does such things as take papers from employees' desks and leave them in the lost and found baskets, and she's sometimes heard at night clicking over the floor in her high-heeled Victorian boots. Some people in the past reported glimpses of a traditional little librarian, hair tightly controlled in a bun, her costume including a long dark skirt. For the last few decades, Rosie's most notable performances have been audible but not visible. A custodian walking alone after the library was closed heard light footsteps and went to investigate, thinking perhaps a patron had been inadvertently left inside. He found nobody and returned to work. Soon he heard the footsteps again, accompanied by a woman's laugh. Hurrying back to the spot the noises seemed to come from, he was again disappointed, but then both footsteps and laughter resumed before his eyes. Some library workers have reported wafting flowery scents that they believe is the phantom's perfume. One of Rosie's feats, however, puts her in an unusual category. An employee who still works at the library reported once seeing a massive old oak card catalog file slowly tipping far enough forward that a drawer fell out. This piece of furniture would take a few stout men to move. So what was going on? A Kansas City psychic called Safina, whom the 1993 reporter quoted several times, said that spirits which remain earthbound may be waiting for something such as for someone else to die before they move on, or they may be guarding something. Perhaps someday some library employee will discover stored items that give a good clue as to why Rosie is so faithful to her location. Rockabye Baby. A remarkable ghost story from near agency close to St. Joseph's concerned a beautiful baby less than 6 months old. The child lived with its young parents in a 115-year-old house that they had just moved into, a place that the mother said looked like a shack from the outside, but had been remodeled and decorated to be quite pleasant and comfortable within. Because their new home was located in a flat open area, the parents were more aware than they had been elsewhere of the sounds of nature, wind, rain, and wildlife. They did not notice for some time that there were unusual sounds inside too. The couple did find that one of their rooms was strangely cold. Even in moderate weather, they often could see their breaths there, and the wife's brother, a young man who ordinarily liked sleeping in unheated rooms, complained when he visited them. Adding a space heater did not much improve the atmosphere. Another room was plagued with insects. At one time, these were crawling creatures, another time those that flew. Once, fat, repulsive grubs floundered around all over the floor. The couple sprayed repeatedly with different products and they stuffed steel wool into all the holes they could find in the boards, but to no avail. All else paled, however, beside the ghostly attention given to the couple's baby. She was really adorable, the mother said, with no qualifications. People would stop us on the street to look at her. Perhaps this proud parent was not surprised that even someone on another plane of existence admired her child. She was shocked, however, to find that their invisible housemate's regard required uncovering the baby and folding her blanket neatly at the foot of her crib. And this in a cold house. The reporter did not press the mother for her quiet acceptance of these events. Did she move the baby into her bedroom? Were the viewings on some sort of schedule that made her certain she could visit the child often enough to keep it covered? She was quoted with, "I knew the men wouldn't do it. I never felt the baby was in danger from this being. But it was weird, you know." The couple left the house in a year or so, not because it was haunted, but because of problems with its water system. Growing up haunted. One of the 1989 paper's longest stories was about a 95-year-old house that had been home since childhood for the family's daughter, Nancy, 18 years old when the article was written. Their mother said that from the beginning, what she termed chattery voices came from their daughter's bedroom, presumably before the child was old enough to be there alone. All members of the family heard activity upstairs when Nancy and her sister were away. The father sometimes argued that the girls had to be home when their mother insisted they had gone out for the evening. Nancy's own descriptions. "I just remember being scared to walk down the hall by myself, because you could always feel a presence behind you, and sometimes footsteps too," she said. "I'd be lying in my bed and see this figure. It looked like a fat person, but not a person like me or you. It was like an outline. The first time I saw it, I didn't go back in my room for a month, and for a while, wouldn't even go in there alone in daytime to get my clothes. You could shut a door or be walking through and shut it behind you, and it would open right back up." Nancy said she felt the ghost had nothing to do with her family. It's their house. They wanted it back, and they're just trying to scare us out of it. A feature that may be unique to hauntings involved a yellow chair Nancy had shared with a deceased cousin who once lived with the family. "I used it for getting ready for school in the mornings. It was just her favorite chair. After she died, I could only sit in one side because it was like there was a person sitting there beside me. I could never get to the other side of that chair. It was just like a wall in the middle of it." When the St. Joseph's newspaper story was written, this family was still in the house and said nothing about leaving it. The mother's final word, "We've been frightened like anyone else would be, but I guess you get used to it." In the mirror. On a certain day between 1880 and 1890, a young St. Joseph's woman went to a studio at 3rd and Felix to have her picture taken. The photographer directed her to a small room where she could take off her hat and tidy her hair before facing the lens. As she entered, the angle of the door and the dressing table was such that she saw her own reflection behind that of another woman who was seated. This person wore a beautiful but long outdated gray silk dress and was working with an elaborate hair arrangement. The newcomer murmured an apology, withdrew, and returned to the waiting room. When the photographer sought her out, she explained that she was waiting for him to attend to his previous customer. He told her he had no other appointments for the afternoon, and went with her to the dressing room, where they found it to be empty. That night, the girl told her family of the odd little incident, and her mother remembered another story from that building. It had once been rented by a popular dressmaker, but this woman moved out abruptly because of something that had happened one afternoon. While she was kneeling on the floor to pin up a customer's hem, the customer suddenly jerked and screamed, and when the seamstress jumped to her own feet, soon enough to see, for a moment or two, both of them reflected in a mirror behind the image of a woman in a gray dress, working with her hair. Nobody stood between them and the mirror. Nobody else was in the shop. They both left, the customer in her half-finished dress, leaving behind the clothing she had arrived in. The seamstress returned later, but only with others to move her belongings to another site. Eventually, from local memory, the whole story was assembled, and it was a classic of the era. A lovely young girl had fallen in love with someone her family disapproved of, eloped, taking little but the expensive dress she wore. Bitterly dismissed by her parents, she felt she had nowhere to turn when her husband proved to be unreasonable and violent, and when he abandoned her in her paid-up hotel room without money. While starving, she kept up appearances, or perhaps somehow comforted herself by continuing to maintain her beautiful long hair in its fashionable style. A neighbor in the hotel heard shouting and weeping from the room, and was relieved when the husband left, but having never been introduced, she was hesitant to approach the wife, and of course never dreamed that the young woman might need anything but moral support. When this neighbor finally did knock on the door, she was horrified that the girl's pallor and loss of weight. The food and medical care she provided were too late. She summoned the girl's father, and he said he would leave home immediately. But communication and transportation being what it was in the time, his daughter was dead and buried in a pauper's grave before he arrived. While the father wept in the empty room, the neighbor saw both of them were reflected in the mirror, and with difficulty, considering her own horror, drew his attention to it, for the image of his daughter had joined them. It remained for only seconds, but both saw her and the father to have that one last remnant of memory, took the mirror away with him. However, over the years, it was discovered that any mirror used in that room might at any time reflect the girl who had gazed at her own reflection there in sad despair. Another White Lady. Missouri Ghost told of the legendary White Lady of Marceline. My father and mother worked in Marceline for a while, whose appearances always meant disaster for trained men. St. Joseph's White Lady was not lethal, but was thoroughly disturbing. Her story took up more than a whole newspaper column in very small print. The tale was related by a woman, then white-haired, who had lived it as a girl of about 20 years. She had gone to a local mansion to keep a friend company while the friend's parents took a week-long trip. The house was centered on an acre of woods, but it did not occur to the guest to be afraid when she spent the afternoon alone there, while her friend Marie made some calls. The guest, whom we'll call Jane, had a piece of needlework she wanted to finish, and was enjoying the peace of the luxurious house. Somewhere, not too close at hand, a yard man was mowing grass, and the cook would be coming in any time to start the evening meal. When Jane heard the back door latch raised, she assumed it was the cook, but was surprised that the footsteps went upstairs, entered one of the bedrooms, and did not come back down. Jane went to the stairs and called out to see if Mary had for some reason entered the back door. Receiving no response, Jane said she was overcome with apprehension. What if a burglar was in the house? What was her duty as a guest? She could only retreat to her own room and lock the door until Marie returned. By the time her friend came back, however, Jane could not bring herself to relate such a trivial episode. But a day later, at about 6 o'clock in the evening, the sun still shining, Jane started upstairs for something she needed. As she reached the landing, she said, "I suddenly stopped. I had heard no sound and felt no touch, but something stopped me. I can only describe it as shock, like having a bucket of cold water poured over me." There, in an open bedroom door, stood a handsome, but as Jane described it, spectacularly tall woman. The woman was dressed in all white, and over her long dark hair, which hung loose, was a white band that crossed the top of her head and fell down each side of her face. The woman smiled sweetly and looked directly into Jane's eyes, and Jane began composing an explanation for being so startled and staring. There was nothing unnatural looking about the woman except her height, but as their eyes held, Jane became certain that she was in the presence of something alien and dangerous. She felt somehow that it was essential for her not to show fear or revulsion, so she apologized for intruding and managed to make an unhurried departure. Jane did, however, insist on going home for the night, so the girls traveled across town and told about the incident. Jane's mother sent one of Jane's brothers back with them and arranged that each night one of the boys would sleep in Marie's home. Then something happened that solved the mystery. While playing the piano one evening, Marie threw up her hands and screamed, and both girls saw the White Lady standing quietly in the big double doorway, looking not in the least threatening and not lingering long. The method of her departure was not described. Did she disappear or walk up the stairs? At any rate, Marie then explained. Her mother had married a doctor whose deceased former wife owned the house they lived in. When he moved his new family there, the former wife made herself obvious, but more in a reproachful than threatening way. For instance, when the new wife and her sister returned from prayer meeting one evening, they saw the former lady of the house entering just before them. Really seeing her in such ways seemed threatening, for the family members were always afraid something worse would happen. And then began such disturbances as inexplicable noises and beds rocking. The doctor and his new wife had discussed selling the house, but felt that doing so quickly would raise questions and make the sale hard. They had hoped to wait a year or so longer. When Marie's parents returned and heard what happened, though, they sold the house at once, taking a severe loss. Apparently the White Lady troubled the buyers, for they too sold the place quickly, and the third owner put it up for sale shortly after moving in. Spending her last week in the neighborhood, the newspaper said, the last owner slept across the street at a friend's house, and they looked out one night to see the haunted house ablaze with lights. These did not stay on long, but all knew the electrician had been there that day to disconnect everything. When this happened again the following night, they summoned the workman again, and she showed them that the lines connecting the house to the city power source were all detached. The next person to buy the house had it torn down, and it was said that when demolition began, all the bells in the house, apparently meaning those for calling servants, began to ring and jangle at the same time. Some credit should be given, and some gratitude expressed to the St. Joseph reporter who collected the last two stories, which were in the page of outstanding ghostly data from 60 or 70 years ago. Introductory material said that this was a woman, but it did not give her name. Also selected short subjects. The stories from St. Joseph's are so numerous and some are so long and complex that the best treatment seems to be picking out bits that are most unusual or seem to give insight into another world. A local woman mailed to the NPG a report of a friend's haunting. Threaded through several necessary slot hooks and spools on a sewing machine, completely disappeared while she briefly used the telephone in another room. The family together repeatedly heard sounds from upstairs that seemed to be boxes falling and glass breaking, but when they went to look, nothing was ever out of order. One time, a figure was seen in the hallway through sheer curtains on French doors, but disappeared as they looked. When they went into the hall, it was empty. Doors all locked on the inside as the family had left them. One family reported that almost nightly they saw a man's figure in a coat and hat move past their picture window, seemingly walking very close to the house. When they went out, nobody was ever in sight up or down the street, and circling their house disclosed nobody and no sign anyone had been there. A mother on Bon Ton Street reported that she never went upstairs alone in her house because she so strongly sensed a presence there and had once felt a touch on her shoulder. Her son, who slept upstairs, found only one disturbance, the recurrent sensation of something running over his body in bed, something heavier than any of the family pets. Final word from a psychic. Another Kansas City psychic, Betty Johnson, was quoted at great length in ghost-filled pages of the St. Joseph newspaper. While evaluating Nancy's home, apparently one of the most haunted in the city, she suggested something new to most of us as a reason why spirits choose not to go to the hereafter. A lot of times, she says, they think they're going to be judged. She listed some of the relatively minor sins that any of us might be concerned about if we faced heavenly court. They are afraid that what waits them. There might be worse than staying here bodiless. Having herself been told that during childbirth she clinically died, Johnson feels that she has experienced something different than we expect. There is a light available to spirits, she said, and describes this as leading to a place that is neither heaven nor hell. It's the place where we meet loved ones before us and have the opportunity to learn from them about the afterworld before we have to enter it. We've been taught to suppose we'll go directly to heaven or hell at the moment of death, she said, but I don't believe that is the way it is. This theory is interesting when compared to one set forth in a 1916 book called Raymond or Life and Death. It was written by Sir Oliver Lodge, a colleague of Arthur Doyle in Exploring the Unknown. Lodge lost his son in World War I, and through various efforts to communicate with his spirit, concluded that Raymond was telling him of a transitional period during which anything is available to a spirit that the body found necessary. This eases entrance into another way of life. The recently departed Raymond said he can live in houses exactly like those they lived on earth. They can eat as long as that is important to them, can pursue their favorite recreations and work, all the while enjoying the company of loved ones who live on a different plane. Newly arrived spirits soon recognize more satisfaction than earth can offer, and gradually come to prefer the lives their loved ones demonstrate to them. Once they are willing to give up all that had tied them to earthly life, they go with joy to a richer existence. And that is the end of that. The next section is haunted houses. So, we're also about halfway through the book. Take care, guys.